The last thing Dr. Priya Nair packed was the photograph of the patient who ended her career. She wrapped it in a page of yesterday's schedule, set it on top of the box, lifted the box onto her hip. 12 years at St. Albans Medical Center. One box, and at the door of her emptied office she stopped, with her back to me, and said, "Ask me not to leave." I need to tell you who we were to each other, because that sentence should have been impossible. Priya Nair and I had been rivals for 11 years, and I don't mean workplace friction, I mean institutional legend. Two trauma surgeons, hired the same July, chasing the same division chief seat since before either of us would admit it. Residents at St. Albans got told about us during orientation. We'd competed over publication counts, complication rates, OR block time, the affections of every department chair, and once, infamously, at a charity gala, over a silent auction espresso machine, where the bidding war got so personal, the hospital foundation still sends us both thank you cards. She reviewed my papers anonymously, and I always knew it was her because the criticism was too accurate. I returned the favor. For 11 years, being better than Caleb Rhodes was her hobby, and being better than Priya Nair was my cardio. And 8 days ago, the peer review committee of St. Albans had concluded that the intraoperative death of her patient, Mr. Daniel Tice, reflected deficiencies in surgical judgment and technique, words that end careers, and offered her the courtesy every hospital offers its sacrifices: resign quietly or be reported to the state medical board. She resigned, and when the whole department suddenly developed urgent elsewhere to be on her last afternoon, the person who showed up at her office door with packing tape and no idea what to say was me, her rival. Because 11 years of measuring yourself against somebody is, it turns out, a relationship, and hers was the only opinion in that building I'd ever actually feared, and I could not stand, watching her disappear into a cardboard box while the hallway pretended not to look. So, the door, the box on her hip. "Ask me not to leave. Stay," I said, instantly, embarrassingly. 11 years of rivalry, and it took me under a second. And Priya Nair set the box down, closed her office door, locked it, and said, "Good, because I need one person in this building with staff privileges and a spine, and God help me, the short list is you." She pulled the wrapped photograph back out of the box and unwrapped it. Mr. Tice, 61, grinning in a fishing hat. The photo his wife had given her after the funeral, which tells you something about what kind of surgeon she was, that a widow gave her a gift. "Caleb, what do you actually know about how my patient died?" "I know the M&M version," I said carefully. "Post-op day 9 of what should have been a recovery. Overwhelming sepsis. Source attributed to the surgical site. Committee said technique. Attributed. She said the word like she was spitting out a suture. Here's what the committee version leaves out. Daniel Tice spent 6 days after surgery reporting uncontrolled pain. 10 out of 10, Caleb, on a standard recovery. Screaming when they moved him, begging, his wife crying in the hallway, and every time, per the chart, he'd been medicated. Full doses, on schedule, signed out of the dispensing cabinet, administered, documented. The chart says comfortable. The man was screaming and the chart says comfortable. Nurses flagged it. Pain refractory to opioids. Pain team consulted, doses escalated. Nothing touched it. And then the fevers started, and the cultures grew an organism. She tapped the photo. A waterborne bug, Caleb. The kind of organism you find in tap water. In a closed post-op patient on IV pain medication with a surgical site that I closed and that looked, at re-op, clean. She let that sit exactly 1 beat, surgeon's timing. So at the M&M I asked one question. I stood up in front of the whole committee, with my career already circling the drain, and I asked, has anyone tested what was actually in the fentanyl vials this patient received? Because there is a known, documented national pattern that explains unrelieved pain plus a waterborne bloodstream infection in a hospitalized patient, and it isn't surgical technique. It's called drug diversion. Somebody pulls the medication, keeps it, refills the vials with water or saline, and puts them back. And the patient gets pain with no relief and bacteria with no source. Her voice stayed level, clinical, and underneath it something was burning with a very steady flame. You should have seen the room, Caleb. I expected an argument. I got silence. And then Dr. Kessler, chairing of course, thanked me for an interesting theory, noted the committee's concern about a pattern of deflecting responsibility, and moved to a vote. 8 days later, here's my box. She picked the photograph back up and looked at it, and delivered the sentence I'd help her prove for the next 3 weeks. They didn't force me out for losing him, Caleb. Losing patients is the tax on this job. I'd have taken my lumps. They forced me out for asking why, which means somebody on that committee already knows the answer, and every day I spend packing boxes, there are patients upstairs tonight screaming into charts that say comfortable. That night I did the thing that would eventually put my own license on the table next to hers. I stayed late, logged into the chart system I still had every right to access, and went looking for the pattern she'd been exiled for naming. It took 4 hours, and I found it, and I want to walk you through it the way it assembled itself on my screens at 2 in the morning, because the horror of it is in the accumulation. I searched, discharged, and current patients flagged by nursing for pain refractory to opioids over the past year. 19 hits. I excluded the ones with explanations, chronic pain histories, tolerance, documented complications. 14 remained. 14 patients across 9 months whose post-operative pain simply did not respond to fully documented, fully administered opioid dosing. 2 of the 14 had developed bloodstream infections with waterborne organisms, Mr. Tice, who died, and a woman in March who spent 11 days in the ICU and survived with a damaged heart valve. And the 14 had almost nothing else in common. Different surgeons. I was on the list twice. Priya twice, half the department represented. Different floors, different nurses, different pharmacists, different shifts. They shared exactly one variable. Every one of them had received injectable opioids dispensed through the OR satellite pharmacy, the small, secure medroom between the operating suites and recovery, the one that stocks the anesthesia workroom. And when I pulled the controlled substance handling records for that satellite, the dispensing logs, and critically, the wastage logs where any unused portion of a narcotic must be squirted out and witnessed by a second set of initials, one pair of initials appeared as dispenser, verifier, or waste witness on the medication chain of 13 of my 14 patients. Dr. Warren Kessler, Chief of Anesthesiology, chair of the peer review committee that had just ended Priya's career for asking about vials. 31 years at St. Albans. The man has a lectureship named after him. He trained half the anesthesiologists in this state. He also, 14 years ago, trained me. Not technically, I'm surgery, he's gas, but in every way that mattered. Warren Kessler pulled me aside after my first intraoperative death as a resident, bought me terrible cafeteria coffee, and talked me out of quitting medicine. He wrote my fellowship letter. He toasts at my department milestones. If you had asked me last month to name the finest physician in that building, I'd have said his name without a full breath, and I need you to hold that alongside everything that follows, because this story cost me 2 things, and only one of them was professional. I sat with the initials until 3 a.m., and at 7:20 that same morning, before I'd told a single soul, before I'd even told Priya what I'd found, my phone buzzed with a text from Warren Kessler. Caleb. Ages since we talked. Breakfast Thursday, the usual spot? Some things I'd value your perspective on. WK, understand what that timing meant. Chart access is logged. Somebody with administrative visibility had watched my 2 a.m. queries in something close to real time, and within 5 hours the subject of those queries had reached out, warm, mentorly, the usual spot, to take my temperature. I showed Priya the text over the phone. Her response was 4 words, go, wear a spine. Breakfast was a masterclass, and I mean that with all the sickness the word deserves. 20 minutes of genuine warmth. My cases, his grandkids, a story about my residency I'd forgotten, and then Warren Kessler stirred his coffee and got to it, gentle as anesthesia. I hear you've been keeping late hours in the chart system. Stir. I want to give you some advice, Caleb, the same advice I'd have given you 14 years ago. Priya Nair is a gifted surgeon and a fundamentally destructive colleague. You of all people know that. You've spent a decade as her favorite target. What happened to her patient was a tragedy. What she did afterward, inventing a phantom crime rather than examining her own hands, that's a pattern, son, and the committee saw it, and the kindest thing anyone did was let her resign with her license intact. Sip. And then, so softly, with such perfect avuncular sorrow, you have a death in your own file, don't you? The Alvarez case 2 years back. Sepsis, if I recall, reviewed and closed, properly closed. It would be an awful thing if all this vile hysteria reopened settled griefs. Peer review exists to protect doctors like you, Caleb. It only works if doctors like you protect it back. There it was, in one paragraph. The character assassination, The tribal loyalty pitch, and, silk-wrapped, deniable, unmistakable, the threat. I chair the committee. I know what's in your file. Files can reopen. I told him I understood him completely, which was the first fully honest sentence of the meal, and I paid for breakfast, which confused him, and I drove straight to Priya's apartment, where she opened the door already talking. Well? Mentor or chairman? And I said, both. That's the problem. Priya, he threatened me with my own dead patient inside a compliment. I've known this man 14 years, and I never once saw the room he actually lives in. And then I told her all of it. The 14 charts, the initials, everything. She listened the way she operates. Total stillness, total absorption. And when I finished, she stood, went to her bedroom closet, and came back holding a small, rigid plastic case, the kind that holds diabetic supplies. She set it on the kitchen table and opened it. Inside, nested in a sock, a glass vial. Fentanyl, 100 micrograms per 2 milliliters, per the label. Intact stopper. A pharmacy lot number. The night Daniel Tice died, she said quietly. I went back to the recovery bay. I don't fully know why. Grief does strange things, and mine apparently does inventory. His last dose had been drawn from a vial that was still in the Sharps adjacent bin, logged as wasted, and every instinct I have said take it. So I did. Broke policy, broke chain of custody, probably broke 3 laws. The committee would have fed me to the board twice over. It's been in my closet for 5 weeks while I decided whether I was a thief or a witness. She slid the case across the table to me, and her voice did the thing where the steel comes all the way up. I've decided. Caleb, how do we find out what's actually in this? The answer was an independent toxicology lab 200 miles away, a chain of custody affidavit we drafted with the help of a healthcare attorney Priya hired with her severance. A precise, unhurried woman named Dana Whitcomb, who listened to our whole story and said, "You understand you're both holding live grenades. Good. People who understand that tend to survive the throw. And 6 days of waiting that we filled with work, because there was more pattern to document, and neither of us has ever been able to sit still next to the other one anyway." The results came on a Tuesday by encrypted portal, and Priya read them out loud in Whitcomb's conference room, and her voice, her steady, M&M-proof, 11 years of never once cracking voice, needed 2 tries on the second finding. Finding 1, fentanyl concentration, 4% of label, 96% of the drug was gone, replaced with water. Not saline, water. Finding 2, bacterial culture of the vial contents, positive. The organism, the same waterborne species, matching strain characteristics, that had been growing in Daniel Tice's blood when he died. There it was, in a PDF. Not a theory, not a pattern, not an interesting question for a committee. The murder weapon, assayed. Somebody had been drawing off the hospital's injectable opioids, refilling the vials from a tap, and returning them to circulation, which meant every one of those 14 patients had been paying twice, once in unrelieved agony because their pain medication was water, and once in bacterial roulette because the water wasn't even clean. Mr. Tice had lost the roulette. The woman in March had nearly lost it, and upstairs tonight, the OR schedule was full. He wasn't stealing drugs, Priya said, staring at the page. 96%, Caleb. He was stealing mercy from post-surgical patients for 9 months minimum, and when one of them finally died of it, he chaired the committee that named my hands as the cause. She looked up. We go outside the building. Today, this never touches another St. Albans committee because he is the committee's. Warren Kessler, it turned out, agreed about the timing because he moved the same afternoon, and he moved like a man who'd built the machine he was now driving. 3 certified envelopes one day, coordinated the way only an insider can coordinate. Envelope 1, to Priya. Notice that a formal complaint had been filed against her with the state medical board. Not about surgical technique. Oh no. About drug diversion. A routine controlled substance reconciliation, conducted with the committee's cooperation, had identified documentation irregularities clustered around cases where Dr. Nair's badge credentials appeared in the medication chain, with an emergency license suspension hearing set for 11 days out. Envelope 2, to me, a letter from hospital counsel noting a pending audit of unauthorized patient record access attached to my credentials, with a reminder about the federal penalties for privacy violations. Envelope 3, also to me, was not a threat. It was worse. It was an invitation to the retirement gala of Dr. Warren Kessler, 31 years of service, 3 weeks hence. The honor of your presence requested. Read his whole play in those 3 envelopes, because it was genuinely brilliant. He was converting Priya from scapegoat into suspect. The diverter herself, badge data and all. Who better to accuse of the crime than the surgeon already ruined for describing it? He was freezing me with an audit that made every piece of evidence I'd gathered look like the fruit of a violation. And he was leaving. 3 weeks. Retirement, emeritus glow, a lectureship with his name on it, and the moment his badge deactivated, the dispensing patterns would stop, the trail would go cold, and the only live question would be which of the 2 ruined surgeons who'd accused the beloved chief had actually been the thief. He wasn't escaping the story. He was assigning it 11 days until my hearing, 3 weeks until he's emeritus and untouchable. Priya laid the envelopes side by side on Whitcomb's table like films on a lightbox. He owns the committee, the audit trail, and the narrative. What don't he own? The federal government, said Dana Whitcomb, and picked up her phone. Which is how, 40 hours later, in a conference room with no windows, Priya and I laid everything in front of Special Agent Ruth Okonkwo of the DEA's diversion unit and an investigator from the State Department of Health, the 14 charts, the initials, the assay, the affidavits, the envelopes, and learned 2 things. Thing 1, they believed us, fast. This profile, Okonkwo said, tapping the wastage logs. Sole verifier patterns, waste witnessed in pairs that never vary, refractory pain clusters downstream of 1 medroom. I've worked 11 of these. This is the textbook. Frankly, the assay alone would open a case. Thing 2, and she delivered it with the flat honesty I'd come to need from her, and none of it convicts him. The vial's custody runs through a grieving surgeon's sock drawer. The logs prove proximity, not hands. A man this embedded, this decorated, with counsel this good? He walks into a jury, as the department saint being framed by 2 doctors his committee disciplined. Unless we catch the swap itself. Hands on vials. No committee in the world can chair its way out of that. She looked at the calendar on the wall, at the 3 weeks we didn't have, and then at me. Dr. Rhodes. You still have privileges, an OR schedule, and his trust. How do you feel about being bait? Here was the operation, as Okonkwo's team built it over the next week. And I'm describing it carefully because the elegance matters. Nothing about it required me to lie, plant, or entrap. It only required the hospital to function normally, with witnesses. The DEA went in over everyone's head, which is the entire point of a federal agency. 2 people at St. Albans were read in, the CEO and the pharmacy director, both under documents with penalties attached, and neither of them Kessler's people, Okonkwo checked, with a thoroughness that told me she'd been burned before. A replenishment batch of fentanyl vials entered the OR satellite pharmacy through the normal supply chain, except every vial in it was photographed, weighed to the milligram, lot mapped, and marked with a covert tagant, and the medroom itself acquired, courtesy of a federal warrant, 2 cameras the size of screw heads with a view of the controlled substance cabinet. My role was almost insultingly simple. Keep my OR schedule full of the big cases I'd normally book, the long ones, the ones that run high volumes of injectable opioid, and be, in every visible way, the loyal mentee who'd taken the breakfast advice. Cases get scheduled, medication flows to the satellite, and a man with a 9-month habit and a 3-week deadline does what habits under deadlines do. The hardest part was none of that. The hardest part was Thursday, when Warren Kessler stopped me in the surgeon's lounge, gripped my shoulder and said, "I heard you've stepped back from all that unpleasantness. I want you to know it means a great deal to me, son. Loyalty's rarer than talent." And I had to let my mentor's hand rest on my shoulder, and smile, and say, "You taught me to know what matters, Warren," and watch him glow at it, and then go scrub for a 9-hour case with my skin trying to crawl off my body. Priya met me at my car that night with takeout, because she'd known. Of course she'd known. 11 years of studying somebody cuts both ways, and we sat on my tailgate in the parking structure eating noodles, suspended surgeon and bait surgeon, and she said, "For what it's worth, watching you be his good boy this week is the finest acting I've seen from a man who can't even fake laughing at the chairman's jokes." And then, quieter, looking at the concrete instead of me, "When this is over, I'm going to stand in a doorway again, and I'm going to say it again, and you should be ready with a better answer than stay, because I'll have options, Rhodes. I'm told I interview well when I'm not being framed." which is as close to a declaration as Priya Nair had ever come, and I spent the next 3 days rehearsing better answers between dread cycles. 2 more things happened during Operation Week, and both of them nearly cracked us, so you get both. The first was Priya's interview with the state board's investigator. The diversion complaint against her, remember, was still fully alive, hearing clock still running, and here was the cruelest wrinkle of the federal case. It was sealed, airtight. Which meant Priya had to sit across a table from a board investigator, accused of the exact crime we could already prove Kessler committed, and defend herself without one word about the assay, the cameras, the operation, or the arrest that was days away, because a single leak would burn everything, and Kessler's counsel would receive the board file in discovery. Whitcomb prepped her for 2 days. You will answer only what is asked. You will be accurate, brief, and boring. You will not solve the case for them, because you are not allowed to, and it will feel like drowning politely. I drove her there and waited in the parking lot for 3 hours. Our relationship, I'd begun to notice, was substantially conducted in parked cars outside buildings where one of us was fighting for our life, and when she came out, she got in, closed the door, stared through the windshield and said, "He built a machine where telling the truth is the only thing that can destroy me, and I just spent 3 hours feeding it nothing, and the investigator thinks I'm hiding something, because I am, and what I'm hiding is my own innocence." Then she laughed, one short, unhinged, magnificent laugh, and said, "Days," Okonkwo said days. "Drive, Rhodes, before I go back in there and testify." The second thing arrived by email that Friday, and it remains the purest piece of dramatic irony I expect to encounter in this life. Warren Kessler asked me to give a toast at his retirement gala. Nobody tells the story of what this place means better than the ones I watched grow up in it. 10 minutes, son, it would mean the world. I sat looking at that email for a long time. The man was, at that moment, on 8 days of federal video, and I understood exactly what it was. It was breakfast, again, a loyalty test with a tuxedo on. Decline, and the mentee who'd stepped back from the unpleasantness suddenly had a reason to be re-examined. Except, and I'd be standing at a podium in 3 weeks, eulogizing a man I'd helped indict, in front of 600 people, some percentage of whom would remember my face doing it. Okonkwo's guidance was one line: RSVP yes, draft nothing, and pray we're faster than the caterer. I RSVP'd yes. I even, God help me, got the tux cleaned, because tradecraft. Priya found the garment bag hanging on my office door and texted me a single sentence that carried us through the worst week of the operation. If you end up actually giving that toast, lead with the espresso machine story, and know that I will rise during it and object like it's a wedding. The gala, I can now report, was cancelled with 11 days' notice. The venue's deposit, per the hospital's general counsel, was not recoverable. I have never once been sorry. One more thing happened that week, and I include it because it's the moment this stopped being our fight and went back to being what it always actually was. Tuesday night, a page. My post-op patient, day 2 of a brutal 10-hour resection, a retired schoolteacher, in uncontrolled pain, nurses at maximum protocol dosing, nothing touching it. I stood in that room at 11 p.m. and watched a 68-year-old woman grip the bed rail and apologize for being difficult, while her chart, pristine, said medicated and comfortable, and I understood that I was looking at patient 15, live, mid-crime. Every fiber I had wanted to seize the vials at her bedside and end it that night. Instead, I did what Okonkwo had drilled. I ordered her switched to an entirely different medication class from the main pharmacy. She was asleep, finally, honestly asleep, within the hour. And I logged the times, and I called it in, and Okonkwo said the sentence that got me through to the end. "That's the last one, Dr. Rhodes. I promise you. He's accelerating. The batch is moving faster than any clean medroom in the country. Keep your schedule. We're days out." We were 3 days out. Sunday morning, 5:38 a.m., ahead of a 7:15 first case. My case, a long one, booked exactly per the plan. The cameras in the OR satellite pharmacy watched Dr. Warren Kessler badge in alone, as he had, the access logs would later show, on 141 early mornings that year. What they recorded took 11 minutes and was, per the agents who narrated it to us afterward, ritual, gloves from his own pocket, not the box, 6 tagged fentanyl vials from the cabinet. The practiced two-handed motion, draw down through the stopper, refill from a sports bottle of water he carried in his jacket, a resealing technique the DEA's lab later called the best they'd documented. 5 vials back in the cabinet, faced label out, neat as a chapel. The 6th, whole and full, into his inside pocket. Wastage log annotated in his elegant fountain pen hand, and at 5:49 a.m., as Warren Kessler turned to badge out, the medroom door opened from the outside, and it was not a pharmacy tech. "Dr. Kessler," said Agent Ruth Okonkwo, with 2 more agents and the state investigator filling the corridor behind her. "Keep your hands where they are. You're under arrest, and before you say anything," she nodded at the ceiling corner, almost courteously, "you should know this room went on the record 8 days ago. They let us be there for the walkout. I don't know if that was procedure or mercy, and I've never asked." The corridor between the OR suites and the elevators at 6 a.m. on a Sunday, the same corridor where he'd once caught a shattered resident by the shoulder and talked him back into medicine. And I promise you I was thinking about that, every step of it. The coffee and the kindness and the 14 years. All of it real and none of it exculpatory, and Warren Kessler in handcuffs and his gala invitation posture, and as they brought him past us he stopped. The agents allowed it, one beat, and looked at the 2 surgeons his committee had processed, and chose, incredibly, to address me, in the mentor voice, one last time. "Caleb, whatever you think you saw, it was never her technique, Warren," I said. "It was your pockets. But the line that ends this story, the one on the news, the one the residents at St. Albans will be told at orientation for the next 30 years, wasn't mine. It was Priya's, and she delivered it into the silence after mine, stepping forward so he had to meet her eyes, in exactly the calm clinical register he'd used to end her career across a committee table. 8 days ago you called me a diverter in a certified letter, Dr. Kessler. I'm accepting the committee's finding." She glanced at his inside pocket, where the 6th vial rode next to his heart. "Wrong doctor, right diagnosis. Now the aftermath. And I'm going to take my time with one part of it, because this story has a wound in it that deserves better than a montage. The legal machinery, first, at speed. Warren Kessler was charged federally with drug diversion, tampering with consumer products, and, once the March survivor's cardiologist and the medical examiner's amended findings on Daniel Tice came in, with charges connected to death and bodily injury that carry the kind of numbers you serve rather than appeal. The sports bottle, the resealing kit found in his locker, the 141 solo early mornings, the 11 minutes of footage, his attorneys took one comprehensive look at discovery and began negotiating. The plea he eventually entered included a factual statement, read aloud, in which he admitted the swaps began 4 years ago, not 9 months. Our 14 charts were the visible edge of something with layers the DEA is still excavating, rooted in a back injury, a self-prescription, and a decade of the kind of secret that metastasizes in men who chair the committees that would otherwise catch them. I sat in the gallery for that reading. I'm not going to perform forgiveness I haven't found, and I'm not going to pretend the man who talked a shattered resident out of quitting medicine wasn't real. Both men existed. One of them protected me for 14 years, and the other one let 68-year-old women apologize for their own agony, and the sentence, 19 years, federal, was handed to both of them at once, because that's how it works. My mentor taught me one final thing, I suppose, that the most dangerous person in any institution is the one whose reputation has become part of its architecture, because everyone would rather shore up the building than check the beam. St. Albans, to its credit, and to the credit of federal consent requirements, let's be honest, did the full excavation. Every patient in the exposure window contacted, tested, offered care, a settlement fund, a new controlled substance protocol with continuous video, and randomized assay audits that other hospitals now fly in to study. The peer review verdict on Priya was vacated in a unanimous emergency session, her record expunged, the board complaint withdrawn with a formal apology, and, in a scene I watched from the back row and will cherish until I die, the same committee that had processed her sat and listened while Dana Whitcomb read into the minutes, slowly, with citations, exactly how each of their procedural instincts had been played by their own chairman. Nobody made eye contact. Several people discovered fascinating things about their legal pads, and Mrs. Tice, because this was always her story before it was ours, Mrs. Tice asked to meet Priya, and Priya asked me to drive her there and wait outside, and I sat in the car for 50 minutes outside a small house with a fishing boat in the side yard. Priya came out with her eyes wrecked and her spine straight, holding a Tupperware of lemon bars, and didn't speak until we were nearly home, and then said only, she apologized to me, for believing the hospital's version. A mile later, I told her that her husband's pain is the reason 14 other families got phone calls and a 15th patient got to wake up comfortable. She said, and here Priya's voice did break. Finally, 5 months late. She said, then he was medicine after all. We sat in her driveway for a while after that. Some silences you don't clip for the highlight reel. You just attend them. Which brings us to a Thursday in autumn and a doorway. Priya Nair got offers, exactly as promised. Vindicated whistleblower trauma surgeon's interview extremely well, it turns out, including chief of trauma at a glittering coastal academic center, the kind of job we'd both have committed minor crimes for in year 5 of the rivalry. And St. Albans, scrambling, finally offered the division chief seat we'd spent 11 years dueling over. To her. Obviously to her. I found out all of this the way I found out everything that mattered that year. Priya Nair appearing in my office doorway at day's end, this time with no box, holding 2 competing offer letters like a hand of cards, and she leaned against the frame and looked at me for a long moment and said, because she is, at her core, a scientist who repeats the experiment until the result is clean. Ask me not to leave. And this time I was ready. 11 years of losing arguments to this woman teaches you to prepare your closing. No, I said, and watched one eyebrow go up into her hair. I'm not asking you to not do things anymore. Here's what I'm asking instead. I stood up and came around the desk. Take the chief job here. Take it because you earned it twice, once by being better than me, which cost me a decade of sleep, and once by being braver than this entire building. And then, Dr. Nair, chief to staff surgeon, boss to subordinate, which I want noted I find hilarious. Let me take you to dinner. A real one. 11 years late. That's my counteroffer. Don't stay for me. Stay. And me. Priya Nair read my face the way she reads a difficult film, thoroughly, twice, and then she smiled the smile I'd only ever seen across an operating table when a bleed finally stopped, and she dropped the coastal offer letter into my recycling bin from across the room, a clean 3-point shot, and said, accepted. Both findings. And then, already turning down the hallway, because she will die before she lets me have a scene's last word. Wear something decent, Rhodes. I've seen your gala photos. I outbid you for that espresso machine, and I'll outdress you at our own dinner. Reader, she did, she does. The espresso machine sits on our kitchen counter, and the plaque under her office door says Chief, and every morning I lose the argument about whose turn it is to use the machine first, and I have never in my life been happier to be second. 2 questions before you go, and this week I genuinely need your answers, because this comment section has readers on both sides of the hospital bed and I've never forgotten it. First, put yourself in that emptied office. You've found the thread, and pulling it means accusing the most beloved, most protected person in the building, with your license, your mortgage, and everything you trained for as the ante, against a man who runs the very committee that will judge the accusation. Honestly now, not heroically, do you pull the thread, or do you pack the box? Because Priya pulled it after they took everything, and I've always wondered if I'd have had the nerve while I still had something to lose. And second, the one I really want, so take a breath before you type. Have you or someone you love ever been in pain that a system insisted wasn't real? A hospital chart that said comfortable, an insurer that said unnecessary, a workplace that said fine, a family that said dramatic, while you knew what you were feeling. Who finally believed you? How long did it take? And what did it cost you to keep saying it out loud until they did? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And I promise you, somewhere in this thread is a person gripping a bedrail right now, apologizing for their own pain, and your story might be the one that teaches them to stop apologizing. Subscribe if this one stayed with you, because next week I'm telling you about the wrong number text that said, "It's done." She never saw the second page of the will, the funeral I attended 3 days later for a woman I'd never met, and what happened when I stood up during the reading and asked the lawyer, in front of the whole family, to show us page 2.